Hey, this is Skullgirdle, and welcome to Where Does the Word Goth Come From Anyway as a definition for this subculture? This musically based subculture that started in the late 70s. Where does the word goth actually connect in? Well, I don't know that I can explain it to the point where it's incontrovertible truth, but I think I can give you some hints that maybe it's not something from architecture or necessarily a strong connection back to some people who sacked Rome. So first, let's talk about the word and its origins, which is like the main body of this video because it's going to take a minute. This is a high-level explanation. That means I'm not going to give you deeply researched facts here. I'm going to give you higher-level facts. So if you want to know more, you can Google it. It's not that hard. You can find it in history books. You can ask a librarian. They would love to help you find out more information about the history of the word goth. So we'll go back to the actual Goths, which were a haptic group in Europe. I'm just going to go Europe. I can't say Northern Europe, Southern Europe. I can't remember the exact area, but we'll go with Europe. And the reason that they're important is because it was, in fact, the Goths who sacked Rome, specifically the Visigoths. Remember that word Visigoth. Now, I know we all saw a video that may not be fully factually correct about the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, blah, 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 blah. It's the Visigoths that we're talking about in this particular instance, and it does have meaning later on down the road as well. That was the actual group that sacked Rome because they had asked Rome if they could stay in the Roman Empire on Roman lands, and Rome's like, yeah, sure, come on, you'll be citizens, you'll be one of us, and then they proceeded to treat them like garbage. Like the untouchable class. They didn't get citizenship rights. They were treated like servants, slaves, etc. just badly. They had no rights, nothing. And they got pissed and they sacked Rome. There could be a more condensed version than that, but you'd be hard pressed to find. If you want to know more about that, again, ask a librarian. They'll be happy to help. That was about 400 something Common Era. So at about the 11th century, there was a cathedral built, Saint Denis, which is the first accepted architectural visualization of what came to be called Gothic. At the time, it was not called Gothic. That was a prototype pretty much, and it collapsed. And through a few different things, they put in the pointed arches and the high spires and lots of stained glass. That is what a Gothic cathedral looks like. Now you have Saint Denis, famously Notre Dame, Rouen, Chartres, Lyon. They're all over the place. There's one in Cologne. There's one everywhere. They're all over Europe. They were popular for a while, which is what the style was called at the time. It was called the New Style. Then it was called the Popular or Fancy Style. And that's what it was called at the time. Now let's fast forward to some douchebag in the Renaissance who felt like he needed to feel superior with the Renaissance, which the Renaissance is a well-rounded era, we have to say, where they went back to classical lines. More of the Greco-Roman influence in some of your architecture and some of your art. You see a lot of Roman and Grecian themes in Renaissance art. And Renaissance is well-rounded. Like if you're a Renaissance man, because of course we wouldn't want to educate women because they're so dangerous and empty, soulless husks, I think is what they thought we were at the time. Then you would learn letters, you would learn science, you would learn math, you would learn art, you'd learn music, you learn penmanship, you would learn politics, you would learn all these things to be a very well-rounded person, and that was the Renaissance. Now, I forget the guy's name because I don't care, called the art of those cathedrals, that remember was called the Popular Style or the New Style or the Fancy Style, called those Gothic because he saw those as the destruction of the classical lines of the Romanesque period, which is a Roman-based period of architecture before then. That's the Renaissance. That's several hundred years later. They didn't call it Gothic at the time, and it was an insult. He was saying that you wrecked beautiful art just like the Visigoths wrecked Rome. I think it's short-sighted. I think that being experimental and expanding our minds and our horizons and ideas is what makes life worth living, and it's how we progress as culture, people, beings, whatever you want to call it. How we move forward into, of course, the Aquarian Age, etc. Let's go forward a few more hundred years into the Gothic literature. Gothic literary style, which started in the mid-1700s with Walpole and now I can't remember anybody else. Good job, Mary Shelley, first recognized horror book. But they were atmospheric, and they were actually considered kind of like pulp fiction at the time. They were popular literature. Again, it wasn't considered great literature at the time. Sometimes now we think of it as great literature. People are, of course, going to argue that too. I don't care. That has a little bit more basis on the feeling of what was called Gothic, but still keeping the kind of insulting title of Gothic because it was seen more like akin to melodrama. I'm not saying that there weren't great authors. I'm not saying that there's not great books there. There absolutely are. I'm just saying what was thought of at the time and later. And it did become its own literary style that's still written in contemporary novels today. Now let's move forward to the late 60s, early 70s, where the word Gothic was first used in journalism that we can easily trace. And that is in reference to The Doors and the Velvet Underground, specifically, I believe, with Nico. And it was used by a journalist in reference to them. The Doors didn't call themselves Gothic, I don't think. Now we're going to move forward into the late 70s, early 80s to some of those bands, post-punk, that had their basis in, obviously, punk, and I think pretty obviously as well, glam rock. Look at Specimen. That's like glam rock in black with a lot of punk elements in their music. Same thing with Alien Sex Fiend. I mean, they don't look the same. And they don't sound the same. Please don't misunderstand me. Alien Sex Fiend and the Sex Gang Children. Yes, I'm leaving so much out as far as bands because the important one here is the Sex Gang Children. At the time, Andy Sex Gang was referred to, and you can read this in Nick Fiend's foreword into The Art of Gothic, which is a book that was put out a few years ago. Nick Fiend from Alien Sex Fiend wrote a foreword, and he actually stated that Andy Sex Gang was referred to as a Gothic goblin. It's kind of interesting. And the Sex Gang Children embraced that and called themselves Goths. Their fans called themselves Goths. So they embraced the term while other bands were fighting against the term Gothic because it was not something that was taken seriously. It was derisive. Interestingly enough, I'm not 100% if this has anything at all to do with Andy Sex Gang being called Gothic. Andy Sex Gang lived in a building called the Visigoth Towers. I know, it's funny, isn't it? I don't know if that has anything to do with him being called a Gothic goblin, but I do believe it does have something to do with embracing goth. Because, of course, you're like, well, I do live in the Visigoth Towers. I've seen that written down somewhere, and I can't, unfortunately, cite the book or interview where I read that. But if you research, I found it, you can too. You can go ahead and call it opinion. I don't care if you call it opinion. Call it opinion. It's an opinion. It's a researched opinion, but it's still an opinion because I don't have a bibliography here. Those are the connections that I know of to Gothic. Then there's Susie Sue saying at some point with Kaleidoscope, I believe it was Kaleidoscope, that they were moving more towards a Gothic sound feel. Do you wonder if she regrets using that now in an interview? I highly recommend seeing some of their interviews. There's one in Australia where they totally pulled an Andy Warhol of everything she said was, I don't know. Oh, it's beautiful. It was a thing of beauty. I laughed so hard watching that interview. It was wonderful. But this is from my own research, from reading and Googling interviews, news articles, or journalistic stories, probably out of magazines. Melody Maker, NME are the two I can think of right now. Those are the sources that I've used along with Nick Fiend's introduction in The Art of Gothic. If you are confused about what I'm saying, or if you want more information, I suggest go talk to a librarian. They can help you find anything. And we need to be supporting our libraries because we don't want to turn into doorknobs of idiocy, just thinking everything needs to be at our fingertips and reading unvetted, incorrect information. Goth, as we know it today, always was, still is, and will remain a musically based subculture. To be goth, you have to love that music and participate in the subculture. The rest, in my opinion, the aesthetic, all that kind of stuff, that's just icing on the cake. Most of us participate in it because, well, we like it. A lot. A lot, a lot, a lot. So, hey, thanks for watching. Until next time.